let's go back. Now let's find out what happens with Pilgrim and Hopeful. Remember, they'd been arrested, falsely accused of causing a disturbance in city of Vanity Fair. They wanted to go through quietly, make it through to the other side of the city and out the city before anything happened, but they were overcome by other children there in Vanity Fair and arrested and promised to be taken before the governor. Now, that's where we left off. So here we go. The governor of the city was one of the wicked prince's chief servants, and he hated the king and his pilgrims almost as much as his master did. When Faithful and little Christian were brought before him, he was quite glad to think that he had an excuse for hurting someone whom the king loved. And he said, "You are two very bad boys, and you must both be beaten, and afterwards you shall be shut up in the prison so that the children of the town may see you." Now, this was a prison cage like that was out in the town. And so all the children of the town may see you and know what will be done to them if they follow your example. It was no use for little Pilgrims to say anything. The tears came into Christian's eyes when he heard the governor's cruel words, and he wondered what was happening to him. Faithful's cheeks grew very white, but he whispered to Christian, "Evangelist said they might hurt us, but if we die, we will die, and Jesus will resurrect us again. I think, not again, but resurrect us. When the time is right, I shall think of the king because he is surely going to help me, and I will not cry." Then Christian determined to be very brave too, and he remembered the picture he had seen in the house of the interpreter of the Good Shepherd, whose feet were torn and bleeding. "He is our prince," thought Christian, and he did not mind the pain. "I must not either, because I am the king's servant, and it is written in my book that the king's servants are to be just like the prince." And although the beating made his back and arms feel terribly sore and bruised, he was brave like a soldier, and he did not cry at all. Pardon me. The iron cage was a place in the middle of the market, with bars of iron in front of it so that it looked like a cage for animals. But they had been beaten, and the little Pilgrims afterwards had chains fastened upon their hands and feet, and then the man who was in charge of them put them into the cage and left them there. They couldn't stand, for they were ill and weak. So they sat down together upon the ground, and each tried to comfort the other by reminding him of the king's promises. "We knew they would be cruel," said Faithful, "but it is for the king's sake, and he will not let them hurt us too much." When the people in town heard that two of the king's pilgrims were in the cage, they were very eager to see them, and soon a crowd of rude boys and girls, and men and women also, gathered around to stare at Faithful and Christian, and to make fun of them in their trouble. The boys of Vanity Fair said all kinds of cruel things to provoke the pilgrims and to make them say something that would displease the king by being angry with their enemies. But Christian and Faithful sat still, and neither of them gave a cross answer to anything that was said. At last some of the boys, when they saw how patient the little pilgrims were, began to feel ashamed, and they cried out, "Leave them alone now. They've been beaten, and they are very brave not to cry. Let's not tease them any more." But the other boys didn't listen and liked to see Pilgrim and Faithful being made fun of. And before long, there was another disturbance in the market, for the boys who were sorry for the pilgrims began to fight with those who were teasing them. And the governor was obliged to send men to stop the fighting. And he ordered Christian and Faithful to be beaten once more and said it was their fault all of this was happening. Then they were taken back to the cage, where they lay all night. When morning came, Christian and Faithful were taken to the governor's court, where the judge sat every day to try any prisoners who might be brought to him. He was an old man with a hard face, and like the governor, he did not like the king or his pilgrims. Christian and Faithful were brought before him with their hands tied, and he asked them where they had come from and what they were doing. Then a boy named Envy, who had been one of the first to run after the little pilgrims and tease them, rose up and began to answer the judge's question. He said he had known Christian and Faithful when they were living at home, and that they were disobedient and quarrelsome back then, and did not honor the wicked prince who was the ruler of their country. Two other boys followed Envy, and they agreed that what he said was quite true. They also told the judge that they were afraid the pilgrims would do great harm to the children of Vanity Fair if they were let loose and given liberty, because they laughed at the treasures with which the wicked prince had filled the city, and said they were not worth having. And they pretended that they knew of a better city and another king, whose laws were better than those of the wicked prince. There were 12 men sitting in the court, whose duty it was to listen to everything that was said about the pilgrims, and then help the judge decide whether they deserved punishment or not. These 12 men were called the jury. Of course, they were chosen from among the chief servants of the wicked prince, and they were not likely to be kind or just to any of the king's pilgrims. However, they always pretended to treat their prisoners fairly. So when Faithful asked if he might speak to them, the judge answered, "You ought to be put to death at once for all that you have done, but we will first hear what you have to say." Christian wondered how it was that Faithful had become so brave. His face was pale, but he did not seem to be frightened, although the judge and the people in the court looked cruel and wicked. Christian afterwards knew that the king had helped his little pilgrim and had made the timid boy brave and strong, so that he was not afraid to speak out and own that he loved his king dearly and would not obey anyone else. When Faithful had spoken, the judge turned to the jury and said, "You have heard what Envy and his companions have told us about these boys, and Faithful does not deny it. He will not serve our prince, and by the laws of our city, he ought to be put to death." Then the 12 men answered, "We can see that both these pilgrims are wicked boys, but Faithful is the worst, because he's not ashamed to speak against our prince. We think that he must be killed, but Christian, he can be taken back to prison." Poor little Christian's mind had been so troubled by all that had happened that he scarcely understood what the jury was saying. And when the soldiers of the wicked prince came in and led Faithful out of the court, he wondered where they were going. In a few minutes he too was taken into the marketplace, and there he saw his companion in the midst of those cruel men who were beating him and wounding him with their weapons. "Oh, Faithful, Faithful," he cried out. But Faithful did not answer. He was looking up into the sky, and his face was shining with a beautiful light. And Christian forgot for a moment that he was in the midst of Vanity Fair, surrounded by the servants of the wicked prince. Suddenly the boys of the city gave a great shout of pleasure, because they liked to see pilgrims punished, and their cries startled Christian, so he turned once more to look at his lost friend. But the king is very merciful, and he did not wish Christian to know how much poor Faithful was suffering. A mist seemed to pass before his eyes, and he cried out again, "Oh, Faithful, Faithful!" And he lay there, Christian did, for some time, feeling too weak to move or speak, but presently he opened his eyes and found that he was back in the prison upon a little bed, and that a woman was bending over him. She was gaily dressed, like all the women of Vanity Fair, and although she did not look unkind, she was very different in her looks. She was the wife of the man who kept the prison, and when the little fainting boy had been carried away from the marketplace by the soldier who had taken charge of him, she had been so sorry to see him that she brought him some water and bathed his hands and face gently, and stayed by him until he revived. "You poor little child," she said presently. "You are too young to be a pilgrim. I should like to keep you here, and I will take care of you." "Oh, you are very kind to me," he said, "but I could not stay, because I am going to the king." "Ah," replied the woman, "I was going to the king once, but the way is very hard, and I've been very happy here in the city." "You would be happier with the king," said Christian. "Faithful is gone, and I need to travel as fast as I can to get to the end of my journey." The woman stroked the boy's hair softly. "Faithful is dead," she whispered. "I was sorry when they told me, but they're not going to kill you. They will only keep you in prison for a few days, and then you will be out. Stay with me," she said. "I will be very kind to you." But Christian shook his head. "I couldn't stay. I love the king, and I must follow him." After a few days, the keeper of the prison came to him and told him that the governor of the city had given an order for him to be set free. So Christian started once more on his journey. The kind woman was very sorry to see him go, and she kissed him and bade him think of her some time. "I will tell the king how good you've been to me," said Christian, "and perhaps one day you will be a pilgrim too." He went quietly down the street, not feeling strong enough to walk very fast, and fearing very much that the boys should run after him again as they had done before. But as Faithful had been put to death, they were satisfied, and although they laughed together when the little pale-faced pilgrim passed by, they didn't touch or interfere with him in any way. He was going through the great archway of the city gate when he heard someone running behind him, and then he felt a hand upon his shoulder. For a minute he was frightened, thinking that his troubles were beginning again. But the boy who had stopped him looked frightened. too, and said in a half whisper, "Let me come with you. I don't want to stay here any longer." "Do you mean that you will be a pilgrim?" said Christian. "Yes, I'm called Hopeful, and I want to go with you. But wait until we are safely on the road, and then I will tell you all about it." Christian tried to walk a little faster, and Hopeful kept close to him, but he seemed afraid to speak until they were some distance from the city. Then he said, "We were very sorry, you know, because they killed Faithful. He was so brave, and I am sure he was good. And there are some more boys and girls, too, who say that they will not stay in the city much longer if such cruel things are done there. I was just passing the prison when you came out, and I watched you, and then when no one was looking, I ran after you. You don't mind me coming along, do you?" "No, not if you really love the king," replied Christian. I thought I should have to go the rest of the way by myself, and I shall be very glad indeed if you will come too." "Yes, I will," said Hopeful. "I wasn't happy, and I always meant to leave the city some day." Christian was just beginning to ask how long Hopeful had been living in Vanity Fair when they overtook another boy who was strolling very slowly on the sunny side of the road. He came from a city not far from Vanity Fair. The people who lived in it called themselves the king's servants and pretended to love him very much, but whenever the wicked prince or his servants came to see them, they stopped talking about the king and behaved as if the wicked prince was their ruler. The wicked prince liked these people, and when he heard that any of them had become pilgrims, he never tried to hinder them in their journey because he knew that they would be sure to turn back again as soon as they met the least difficulty or danger. The boy, whose name was By-Ends, By-Ends, his name was By-Ends, joined Christian and Hopeful and walked with them for a short time. He told them all about his relations and friends who were very rich people, and he seemed proud of his high position and inclined to despise Christian and Hopeful. "Isn't it a beautiful day?" asked Hopeful presently, for the sun was shining brightly, and the breeze was soft and pleasant. "Yes," replied By-Ends, "it is just nice for traveling, but pilgrims from our city never start out in the winter. We always choose clear summer weather for our journeys. It is just foolish to tire yourself with struggling against the wind and rain." "There are storms even in the summer," said Christian. "Oh, you needn't travel in them. If it begins to rain, I should creep under a thick bush and wait until it is fine again." Christian couldn't help smiling, but he answered, "I am sure good pilgrims never do that. We ought not to mind about the weather." "Well, of course," said By-Ends, "you can do as you like. We need not quarrel about it. If there is a storm, you can walk on through it if you choose, but I will certainly wait until it's over." Now Christian had read in his book that it is unwise for pilgrims to have friends who are not the king's true servants. So he said, "I'm afraid if you think in that way, we shall not be good companions for you. We must go straight on, whether it is fine or stormy." "Very well," answered By-Ends, "you had better go on by yourselves. I was very happy before you came, and I'm sure I don't want you to stay with me." It was a pity to vex him, said Christian as he walked on with Hopeful, but I don't see how we could have helped it. If we stayed with him, and there happened to be a storm, he might persuade us to turn back altogether. By ends had really been feeling rather lonely and was very glad when Christian and Hopeful overtook him. But he was too idle and fond of his own comfort to be willing to serve the king faithfully as they wished to do. He put his hands in his pockets and tried to look as if he didn't care when they left him, although he felt almost inclined to run after them and say that he didn't mind storms any more than they did. It wouldn't signify, he thought. They couldn't make me go any farther than I wished to, no matter how much I promised them. They are silly boys, but their company would be better than none. But before By-ends had made up his mind what to do, he heard shouts behind him, and turning round, he saw 3 of his schoolmates beckoning him to wait for them. "Where are you off to?" they cried as they came up to him. "There wasn't anything particular to do at home," said By-ends, "so I thought I'd try being a pilgrim." "We'll go with you. And who are those 2 boys up in front? We saw you talking to them." "Oh, they are pilgrims too," replied By-ends, "but not our sort. They are servants of the king. I told them I should only travel while the weather was fine, so they said I might stay by myself. I don't see the use of plodding over rough roads in wind and rain. You may just as well stop until the storm is over." "Of course," said one of the boys, "but the king's servants are always like that. And if you don't exactly agree to everything they say, they won't have anything to do with you. However, what does it matter? Let them alone, and we shall have a nice party by ourselves as we go along." By-ends and his schoolmates walked on together, laughing and talking. Christian and Hopeful were not far away from them, and presently the 4 boys caught up with them and began to ask them foolish questions. They pretended that they wanted to know about some of the things they were fond of doing if they were wrong and likely to displease the king, and they hoped that Christian would not be brave enough to answer them truly, because then they would be able to call him a coward. Now, let me make sure I read that right. They pretended that they wished to know whether some of the things which they were fond of doing were wrong and likely to displease the king, and they hoped that Christian would not be brave enough to answer them truly, because then they would be able to call him a coward. Okay. But although little Christian was a shy and timid child, he was not afraid to speak the truth. He had learned to love the king dearly, and no fear of what these rough boys might do to him would have made him agree with By-ends and his friends. He answered all their questions bravely and truly, and at last they began to feel ashamed of themselves and said no more. Christian was very glad when they left him, and he went on with Hopeful, while By-ends stayed behind with his 3 idle companions. Very soon the little pilgrims came to a narrow plain where the pathway was smooth and easy, and just beyond it they saw a hill with an opening in its side like the mouth of a cave. A lad was standing upon the hill, and when Christian and Hopeful passed by, he called to them, saying, "Come on up here, and I'll show you something." "What is it?" asked Christian. "It's a mine of silver," said the lad. "It's full of rich treasure, and you can gather up enough to take with you on your journey." "Oh," cried Hopeful, "let's go look at it." But Christian pulled him back. "No," he said, "it is not a safe place." Then he called to the lad, whose name was Demas, and asked him if it were not dangerous. Demas knew quite well that it was very dangerous indeed, but he was a servant of the wicked prince, to whom the mine belonged, and he had been sent there on purpose to tempt the pilgrims by telling them of the rich store of silver inside. So he answered, "Oh, it's safe, unless you're careless." But Christian turned away, saying to Hopeful, "We will not go. I am sure I've heard about this, and you see, we could not reach it without leaving the way of the king." Then Demas cried, "If you will not come, you might at least wait for me, and I will go with you. I'm a pilgrim too." "I don't think you're one of the king's pilgrims," replied Christian, "and you would not try to hinder us in our journey. We cannot wait for anyone." So Demas said no more, but watched for Biens and the other boys who were not far off. Hopeful turned round to see what they would do. They did not love the king, and they did not care at all about the celestial city to which they were pretending to go. So, when they heard of the treasure hidden in the hillside, they hurried eagerly to the mouth of the cave. Demas knew that people who went into it to dig for silver were nearly always lost or killed in the mine. But he told Biens and his friends that it was safe, and they were ready to believe everything he said. Christian and Hopeful saw them enter the cave, but no one ever heard anything of them again. No doubt they ventured too far along the dark and winding passages, and were never able to find their way back in to the daylight. When the little pilgrims had walked for some distance beyond the hill, Hopeful stopped suddenly, saying, "Oh, what can that be?" Christian looked where he pointed and saw a strange white figure standing by the roadside. As they came nearer, the boys saw that it did not move, and that it was in the shape of a woman, with her face turned away from the celestial city. "Do you think she was a pilgrim?" whispered Hopeful. "I don't know," said Christian. "It looks like a statue. I wonder why it is placed here by the wayside." They walked around it and looked at it carefully, and at last Hopeful saw a few words carved upon the border of the woman's veil, just where it lay upon her forehead. They were old and worn, and he could not make them out, but after puzzling over them a little, Christian read the words, "Remember Lot's wife." "I know what it is now," he said. "I read about it in the library of Palace Beautiful." Then he told Hopeful how the king had once rescued a man named Lot, with his wife and 2 daughters, from a city which was being destroyed for its wickedness. He sent an angel to bring them out, and the angel told them not to look back. But Lot's wife did look back, and the moment she turned to look, her body grew stiff, and she became a pillar of salt, so that she could never move again. "What a dreadful thing," said Hopeful. Is it put here to frighten us?" "Not to frighten us, I think, but to make us careful. I am very glad we did not go up the hill when Demas called us." "So am I, for I should not like the king to punish us." The two boys were obliged to travel very slowly that day on account of Christian's weakness. "Where shall we sleep?" asked Hopeful. "You cannot walk all night, and it will be not safe to lie down by the wayside." "Perhaps there's another house like Palace Beautiful," replied Christian. "I was happy there. You cannot think how kind Discretion and her daughters were to me." Then Hopeful began to ask questions about them, and Christian tried to tell him of all that he had seen and heard at the palace. But the little pilgrim's strength was failing after the day's journey, and he soon became too tired to speak and could scarcely walk, even with the help of Hopeful's arm. Hopeful was kind and gentle and did all he could to cheer his weary companion, but he began to feel very anxious when he saw that Christian's face was growing paler and paler every minute. "If we could only find a place to rest in," he thought. And as the evening shadows closed round the pathway, he strained his eyes eagerly in the hope of seeing something in the distance which would tell him that they were coming near a house where they might stay the night. But no light of a house appeared, and presently night came on, and still the little pilgrims crept slowly along, for Christian would not be persuaded to lie down in the grass, although Hopeful promised to watch carefully by his side. "We will go on," he said. "I don't think the king will forget us. He knows how tired we are, and he will be sure to give us rest soon." And now the stars began to twinkle in the dark sky, and the moon rose over the hills and shed her pure soft light upon the way of the king. And as Hopeful looked forward, he saw that the pathway was widening and that a broad river was flowing in the distance. "We are coming to a beautiful country," he exclaimed. "Look, Christian, the river is close to the wayside, and the path must lead through that meadow, which is all fenced in and safe." Christian looked, and the sight of the river and the hope of resting revived him a little. In a short time they reached the brink of the water and found that Hopeful was right. The way of the king ran close to the river, which was called the River of Life, and the ground on both sides of it was protected by strong fences, forming a beautiful meadow covered with soft grass and flowers and shaded by tall spreading trees, under whose boughs the king's pilgrims might rest safely and have no fear of enemies. How thankful Christian was to lay his aching little body upon a mossy bank. Hopeful sat by him and watched the moonlight playing peacefully upon the rippling water. Soon he clasped Christian's hand, saying, "The wicked prince never comes here." "Oh, no," said Christian, "I am sure he does not. It is all so still and happy here." The little pilgrims lay down side by side and slept quietly until morning. When the sun rose, a messenger came to them from the king. "This is the Valley of Peace," he said. "You are to stay here a few days until Christian grows strong again. You will find plenty of food, for the trees are full of fruit, and you must drink the water of the river, which will strengthen and refresh you." So the boys spent a whole week in the beautiful valley, resting and enjoying their life more and more every day. Christian was not afraid to loosen his armor in this quiet spot, and he used to sit by the river, leaning comfortably against the trunk of some wide-spreading tree, while Hopeful lay on the grass near to him, plucking the flowers or gathering up the delicious fruit, which was now ripe and falling from the heavily laden boughs. After all Christian's troubles, the valley of peace seemed very pleasant. And soon the color came back to his cheeks and strength to his limbs, and he felt able to continue his journey. "I don't think we're very far from the celestial city," he said, "and I should be so glad to get on my journey again. After this rest, we will be able to travel faster." The little pilgrims left the valley of peace early in the morning and traveled along the way of the king. All that day, late in the afternoon, they came to a place where a stile led them into a broad green meadow. It was called Bypath Meadow, and it belonged to a cruel and powerful giant named Despair. He was one of the most famous soldiers in the wicked prince's army, and he lived in a strong castle beyond the meadow, which could not be seen from the way of the king. This was all written in Christian's book, but he did not think of looking at it just then. The boys were both feeling very tired. They had found the path leading from the river rough and stony, and their feet were sore and aching. Christian stopped when he saw the stile and leaned over it. A fence divided the meadow from the way of the king, but a smooth, grassy path ran close to it. "Could we not walk along this path for a little way?" he said, turning to Hopeful. "The stones are so hard and my feet ache dreadfully." "So do mine," answered Hopeful, "but would it be safe?" Then he came to the stile also and looked over. "Oh, I think it must be," said Christian. "See, it runs close to the fence. We could climb back over again any time we want." Hopeful did not feel quite sure that they were doing the right thing, but as he thought that Christian knew more about the king's laws than he did, he followed his companion into the meadow. The grass was soft and pleasant to their feet, and not far before them another boy was walking along near the fence. Now, remember, a stile is what are steps that go up and over the fence to the other side. And so after they got over, they found another boy walking along near the fence. Christian called to him, saying, "Can you tell us where this path leads?" The boy, whose name was Vain Confidence, turned round and replied, "Why, to the celestial city." "You see," said Christian, "I was right. We shall be quite safe here. We can keep behind that boy, and then if there is any danger, we shall know in time to escape and get back over." But Hopeful was not satisfied, and when the night came on and the shadows grew so thick that the figure of Vain Confidence could no longer be seen, he felt frightened. Suddenly a cry was heard, and a sound of falling. Hopeful seized Christian's arm and clung to him in great fear, and Christian, too, lost his courage and began to tremble from head to foot. What could have happened, he said, and he called again to vain confidence, but he received no answer. Only through the darkness the boys could hear that someone was groaning as if in pain. I am sure we are not on the right way, said Hopeful, and it is so dark. Christian didn't answer. He knew now that he had done wrong in climbing over the stile, and he wondered how he could have been so foolish as to think that any path could be safe which led them out of the straight road. But before he could speak again, he left some heavy some heavy drops of rain upon his face. He must be a typo. He felt. Then a bright flash of lightning darted across the sky, and a roar of thunder followed. The rain poured down in torrents, and the thunder and lightning were more fearful than any which the boys had ever seen before. Christian began to cry, and to wish that he had not been so careless. It was all my fault, he said. Oh, Hopeful, I am so sorry. I deserved to be killed, but you would never have come if I had not persuaded you. I might have, said Hopeful, not liking to hear poor Christian's sobs. Don't cry, Christian. It was my fault, too, because I didn't prevent you from crossing over. Let's turn back, said Christian. Perhaps we can find our way. By this time the heavy rain had filled the little streams which ran through the meadow, and the path by the fence was flooded. The water was so deep that the boys could scarcely keep their footing, and they began to fear that they would never get back to the way of the king. The storm lasted for many hours, and although Christian and Hopeful struggled on bravely, they soon found that it would not be possible to make their way to the stile in the darkness. So at last they crouched down together in a little sheltered corner close to the fence, meaning to watch for the first gleam of daylight and then hasten on their way. But they were both worn out with fright and weariness, and before the morning came, they fell fast asleep. And wouldn't that be a good place to stop? But we still have 5 minutes, so we're going to go on. The storm passed away before daybreak, and the sun rose in a clear sky and shone brightly over the way of the king. Christian and Hopeful were lying under the shadow of the fence and did not feel the warmth of the sunbeams. So instead of making their way back to the stile in the early morning, as they had intended to do, they slept soundly and knew nothing of the danger which was close at hand. Giant Despair had heard the storm raging, and he came down from his castle soon after sunrise, and walked through his fields and meadows to see if any harm had been done by the wind and rain. Last of all, he crossed Bypath Meadow, and on his way home passed by the very spot where the little pilgrims were sleeping. Hopeful's dress, which had once been white and new, had now become soiled and shabby from staying in Vanity Fair, but Christian's armor still looked bright, although it was sadly splashed with mud through which he had walked the night before. The giant caught sight of his shining helmet among the bushes by the fence, and he turned at once to see who was there. They are pilgrims of the king, he said to himself, and he smiled to think that they were in his power. A loud voice roused Christian from his dreams, and when he opened his eyes, he saw the giant stooping over him. Despair was a terrible-looking man, with shaggy hair and a beard, and clothes made of rough skins of animals. Christian cried out in fear when he saw him, and this roused Hopeful, who sprang up trembling. "What are you doing here?" asked the giant. "We are pilgrims," answered Christian, whose lips were quivering so that he could scarcely speak, "and we have lost our way." "You have no right to sleep in my meadow," said the giant, and his voice was harsh and deep, and the boys were more frightened by it than they had been by the storm. "I shall take you back with me to my castle." The poor little pilgrims knew that they were quite helpless. If they had tried to run away, this strong man would have overtaken them in a moment. He drove them before him across the fields to his house, which was called Doubting Castle, and put them in a dark dungeon, locking the door behind him. All day and all night they lay there upon the bare ground, without food or water, and not even able to see each other. Hopeful crept close to Christian, and they clung together, wondering whether the giant would soon come and put them to death. Christian's heart was very full of grief, because he felt that he had caused all this trouble, and now he feared that the giant would kill them both and that they would never reach the celestial city. Giant Despair had a wife whose name was Diffidence. He told her that he had found two little pilgrims, sleeping in his meadow, and that he had brought them home and locked them up in one of his dungeons. Diffidence was very pleased to hear this, and being a cruel woman, she said that she hoped her husband would beat his little prisoners. So in the morning, the giant took his club and went down to the dungeon. When he had beaten the boys, he left them again in the darkness, and they were so bruised by the heavy blows that they could not move, but lay on the ground all day, moaning with pain. Next day, Despair visited again, and seemed surprised to find that they had not died. He told them that he should never let them leave his castle, but that if they did not wish to die for want of food, they might drink some poison which he would leave with them. Then Christian begged him to have mercy on them and to set them free, and this made the giant so angry that he rushed upon them and would have killed them, but his strength suddenly failed, and he was obliged to leave them alone for a time. In the bright weather, he often had fits of weakness and lost the use of his hands, so that sometimes the pilgrims whom he carried into his castle were able to escape from him. Christian did not know this, and he began to think it was now foolish to hope for deliverance. "What shall we do?" he asked. "If we are to stay here until we die, would it not be better to drink the poison than to die slowly for want of food?" "I am sure we must not do that," said Hopeful. "If we were to kill ourselves, we would never make it to the celestial city. Perhaps if the giant is ill again, he may forget to lock the door, and we may be able to slip out before his strength comes back. Let us wait a little longer, and the king may show us a way to escape." And that ends that chapter, and this time we will stop here, find out what happens next time, Lord willing. So we're going to close now. Okay, let's have prayer. Dear Father, we are thankful for these encouraging words. Not so encouraging right here in the castle of despair or whatever it's called, but Lord, we know you're with us every step of the way, and we thank you for that. Where would we be without it, Lord? We're pilgrims too, and so I ask that you will bless each one who's listening. Help us to be faithful and true, and to continue our journey, if it's so called, to the celestial city. Bless each one. Bless the children, Jillian, and the rest. And we pray that you will keep us safe until we meet again in 1 week. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.